So I've talked a lot about the languages that are within the EU legal framework, and what about the other languages? Well, any other language other than these 23 has no formal real status at all in the European Union framework. That's the most important thing to say. Also, when the European Union talks about other languages, it uses very much Council of Europe language. It talks about regional or minority languages. So it doesn't matter if you're a large language community, a medium language community, a tiny language community, or even a past language community, you're grouped together as a regional or minority language from the perspective of the EU. There are some signs of formal change, and the example I've given here are the Council conclusions of June 2005. This is the idea that the state, rather than the EU, is a bridge between language communities whose language is not recognised in the EU and the EU itself. In other words, the state undertakes the translation arrangements and the state pays for it. There's a number of possibilities, and I've given you the two most important ones, I think, that certified translations of legislative acts can be published in other languages, and crucially published on the Council website, not sort of lost in an archive somewhere for a PhD student to find in 40 years and think, isn't this interesting? But actually as an active, live source of law on the website. And also communications with the EU institutions. So I mentioned earlier, if you were an EU citizen and you chose to communicate with the Commission through Spanish, you can. But if you would like to communicate with the Commission in Catalan, you go through the state. The state provides the translation and forwards it to the Commission for you. To date, 2 member states of 27 have actually engaged with this process. You can see that Spain did this in 2006 when it said that languages other than Castilian Spanish whose status is recognized by the Constitution are languages that they would undertake these obligations for. And also the UK, languages whose status is recognized in the United Kingdom's constitutional system. It's a bit harder to know what languages they are because the UK hasn't got a written constitution, so we assume that they mean the languages that the UK has nominated under the European Charter for lesser used languages. This idea of the state acting as a bridge between language communities and the EU, it reflects very much the idea that the EU is what's normally called a space of multi-level governance. We have these central institutions, we have states, we have local authorities, we have citizens, and they all interact within the EU somehow. So giving the states a role here is something that fits with the idea that the EU works on many levels. But I'll come back to this again later on. Does it actually happen in practice? It's all very well for states saying they will do something, but are they doing it? Do people know they can access this? Are states paying for it, etc.? And we'll come back to this. So before we leave the legal framework, just a summary of the key themes. We have 23 equal languages in formal terms in the EU language arrangements. Anything else is formally outside the arrangements and is grouped together as a regional or minority language. There is an evolving role of the state in somehow acting as a bridge between language communities and the European Union for languages which are not in the formal EU language policy. Although there are a number of language rights in the EU, they come with conditions and limits attached, and we'll see some examples in a moment of this. We are, I think, entering a phase where EU law has to engage more with the language of rights and discrimination in these issues because of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. But underpinning all of this, we have enormous complexity, huge logistical complexity in working through 23 languages, and inevitably then compromises will have to So just moving on to give you some examples of how this might work in practice. I looked at two areas for the purpose of the presentation, and I'll come back to both of these areas, particularly with particular questions for medium-sized language communities in the final part. What I wanted to look at were these bodies, offices, and agencies of the European Union. These are the executive offices of the European Union. The Council and the European Parliament adopt EU law, broad framework measures, but these bodies, offices, and agencies have an incredibly important role in the actual day-to-day administering of lots of EU policies. And they're also, as I mentioned, most likely to be the EU agencies that citizens or businesses actually engage with or have to engage with. They're also being created with increasing frequency in recent years. There seems to be a new EU body, office, or agency on a monthly basis at the moment. And that's why it's interesting to see where member state thinking is about language arrangements at the moment, because as I mentioned earlier, the member states have to agree the language rules unanimously. So the member states are very much involved in determining the language rules that actually apply. Now, I've given a summary of three main types of language rules that are at work in these bodies, offices, and agencies. And I'll actually come back and talk about number one at the end. I should have thought of that when I was doing the presentation, but I think it works better to come back to number one. For some bodies, offices, or agencies, if you look at point 2, Regulation number 158 applies in a straightforward way, and I've given some examples: the European Asylum Support Office, the Institute for Gender Equality, the Maritime Safety Agency. What this means is that there is just one provision in the founding document of all of these agencies saying that Regulation 158 applies, which means 23 official and working languages for these agencies. There is an interesting other group of bodies and agencies under point 3, however. They're not very many, but what I have noticed is that it's what's happening in the more recent measures. So I wonder if we'll see more of number 3 coming up, which is that Regulation 158 applies. So you have 23 official and working languages, but the bodies can themselves come up with more limited internal language arrangements. So it's a bit like our Court of Justice in a way. These bodies, offices, and agencies are free to work internally through the language or languages they decide on through their own administrative board. Citizens or businesses communicating with them are not disadvantaged, however, because it's made clear that Regulation 158, the 23 official languages, apply for external engagement. And this may be something, on the theme of compromise, this may be something that we start to see more and more. Also, if you're a citizen or a business engaging with these agencies and you have a broad language choice, it fits better with the idea of a union where we have a legal principle against discrimination on grounds of language. And the reason I wanted to leave number 1 until last is that there are some offices and bodies which work in a very, very different way. I mentioned the CIC case law earlier, the Office for Harmonisation in the Internal Market. If you were a business, you may well end up dealing with the Office for Harmonisation in the Internal Market, trademarks, management of internal market standards, and so on. And they work through 5 languages: English, French, German, Spanish, and Italian. The European Patent Office, there's a proposal to develop the idea of an EU patent. The European Patent Organization already exists, but not within the EU. So this organization has always worked through English, French, and German only. Now what the EU patent proposal wants to do is bring the organization within the framework of the European Union to develop this EU patent. But the original proposal also said we'll bring the 3 languages with us. It has taken over 10 years and the member states still cannot agree that these 3 languages are acceptable. it has caused huge political delay on actually getting the patent system up and running. Because interestingly enough, actually, in the Cicle case law, Spain intervened to say that 5 languages was perfectly acceptable, because Spanish was one of them. It's not too happy now at the European Patent Office working through English, French, and German. So there are very difficult discussions going on still, and this idea of the state as a bridge is potentially emerging as a recent solution, that the office will work through 3 languages, but states will be responsible for translations into different languages for businesses or citizens who do not want to, who do not choose to use English, French, or German. So the Commission has recently published a proposal along these lines, and we may actually get to an EU patent. But I think what the examples under Category 1 show us is that even though on paper we have 23 official and working languages, in practice we don't. And there are difficult questions here. In Cicle, the Court of Justice said that the 5 languages that OHIM worked with were the most widely known within the EU. In the proposal for the European patent, the Commission said 90% of patent applications are already made in these 3 languages. Where do you draw the line of compromise? Where do you accept limitations in the interest of efficiency and reducing costs? And where do you push and say no? These examples have shown us this. Interestingly, one of the arguments emerging about restricting rules for offices under Category 1 is that those most likely to deal with them are economic actors, not private citizens. But an economic actor can be one sole trader as well. It doesn't have to be the Microsoft Corporation. And I think saying that economic activity excludes the application of broader language rules is a very blunt test, which doesn't really link to most business experience. So what we see, I think, through this example is that we may have 23 treaty languages, but in reality, we have a distinct difference between external languages for communication normally and internal working languages of bodies and agencies. And we also have some important EU bodies and agencies who are working through many fewer languages than 23, and the Court of Justice has so far said this is justifiable in the case of Cicle. So a much more nuanced picture, I think, in reality under the procedural rules. Looking at the second part of the case study, the substantive challenges, and thinking about internal market law, again thinking about the free movement across 27 states of goods, people, money, services on an ongoing basis. We have 2 broad types of EU lawmaking under internal market law. You have positive lawmaking, legislation, harmonizing legislation, adopted normally by the Council and the European Parliament. Member states have full decision-making capacity in the Council. So if you're introducing languages, restricted rules, for example, not all food products have to be labelled in the language of a state, for example. Member states are feeding into this discussion and being part of the lawmaking body. One of the things as an EU lawyer that I get very frustrated about with the media when they talk about Brussels, as if there was some organic thing called Brussels, which had its own power. It just doesn't work that way. The Council is one of the most powerful institutions of the EU, and the Council consists of the representatives of member states. So these choices in positive legislation are fully fed into negotiation-wise and decision-wise by member states. What's particularly interesting for, I suppose, the EU lawyers is negative law. This is where states want to do something which does restrict freedom of movement, whether it's the movement of products, whether it's the movement of workers, whether it's the movement of services. But the reason they want to restrict free movement is grounded in a national policy objective, such as the protection of languages that have official status or not within the state. This is a very, very difficult balancing act, because 27 states have signed up to the EU and have signed up to an internal market and have committed to knocking down borders across the states. And the Court of Justice sees this as a collective value and tries to promote freedom of movement across the internal market. But states also often want to keep restrictions in place for very good reasons, such as language policy. And it often falls to the Court of Justice to decide whether the national law can remain in place, notwithstanding the restriction of the market, the internal market, or whether the national law has to fall in order to promote more freedom and more access to that market for products and people and services from other states. Now, what we see as a general trend in the case law is that the Court of Justice often says, we agree with your policy objective. We agree that language policy is a good thing. But, and the reasons 2 and 3 on the presentation, you've said that this measure will protect your languages, but you haven't shown us how. You haven't proven it. You haven't brought evidence. Or, we accept your policy reason, but the measure is going too far. It is disproportionate to protecting the language goal. So we find often that the Court of Justice is sympathetic to states' policy arguments, but the state measure almost never succeeds. It is almost always going to fall in order to promote access to the internal market across borders. So we have a recognition of principle, but almost never practical success. So what does all of this mean, finally, for medium-sized language communities? At the procedural side of things, it is very clear that some medium-sized language communities fall within EU 23 and others do not. And that decision has nothing to do with criteria such as the needs of the language community, the concerns of the language community, even the size of the language community. It is about being a state language or not being a state language. It's a very formalistic distinction. If your language falls within EU 23, you do have a natural advantage. It is routine that you can go on the European Union website and look up whatever you want normally in your own language. You access legal texts, you can communicate with the institutions, bodies, and so on. It's not that simple, as we've seen, because official status alone does not secure effective or meaningful representation within the EU. We've seen, realistically, English, French, and German being the most commonly used languages. It's not, official status isn't enough to protect your language within the EU. But at the procedural level, something that medium-sized language communities often engage with is wanting formal inclusion in the EU language regime, wanting to be a full treaty language alongside Maltese and Danish and German, and thereby becoming one of the EU 23, thereby becoming formally at least an official or working language of the EU institutions. But I think it's important to reflect and ask, what is it you think that means? Why do you want to be an official EU language? I think the most obvious reason is is a symbolic dimension. I don't mean symbolic in an empty sense. If you are supposed to be a citizen of the European Union, why should your language not be reflected as part of the polity? So symbolism in actually quite a meaningful way. Then there's also a functional dimension to official status. I've given an example here of a European Parliament resolution from 1995, which said in very strong terms that there should be no distinction between any of the official and working languages in the European Union, and that the Parliament would resist English, French and German becoming the de facto languages. But it's the European Parliament resolution on the use of official languages in the EU institutions. The whole resolution is grounded in rights of expression and representative democracy. But does that mean that medium-sized language communities who don't have official EU status have no rights to expression or no place in representative democracy? There's a contradiction in the European Parliament's own resolution. The questions I've raised at the end here, really for be interested in the answers, is if you do want to seek official status in the EU, why medium-sized language communities and not languages fewer than 1 million speakers, for example? What is it about the size of the medium-sized language community that justifies official status? The second question, are these emerging procedures whereby the state can act as a bridge between the language community and the EU enough or not? Now, they're certainly not enough if only 2 states out of 27 have used them to date, and if most people probably don't even know within the UK or Spain that they could use other languages to communicate with the EU through the state. If that was upgraded to a requirement, if states had to translate for citizens from other languages, would that be enough? Or is there still something about being an official language of the EU that's important? And the final question, if more medium-sized languages were official languages of the EU, would you be prepared to give up on some of the functional issues? Because if you had an EU with 35 or 40 official languages, it's impossible to work through that many in practical terms or financial terms. What are the compromises that would need to be made, and which ones would be acceptable? Could you really exercise language choice in all avenues, or would you have to be content with language need and only demand communication with institutions, bodies, or documents when there's genuine language need? Finally, on the substantive challenges, I mentioned that states find it virtually impossible to protect different national spaces within EU law when a national measure or practice encounters free movement of goods or free movement of people. But I think this is something shared by all communities within states, not just language interests, any kind of public policy interest, and also it's across language communities. So I didn't quite find a specific medium-sized language community dimension on the substantive side quite so much as on the procedural side. But I'm normally quite an optimistic person, so I thought I would leave on an optimistic note, which is an unusual case within EU law, the Uteca case, which related to Spanish legislation on the funding of films. And the legislation imposed funding allocation rules on television operators. They had to allocate 5% of their spending on European films, and the Spanish legislation said that 60% of that 5% had to be dedicated to films produced within languages that had official status within Spain. This restriction was challenged because if you're forcing people to buy films in the languages with official status in Spain, you're allowing less space for German films, Danish films, Irish films. The market is restricted. Now, the first step in the judgment was that the court said, yes, protection of languages is a very good thing. We expected that. But then we expected the court to say, but this is disproportionate and you cannot restrict the market for filmmaking in this way. But they didn't. They actually said the fact that a linguistic criterion may constitute an advantage for cinema production undertakings which work in the language covered by that criterion, and which accordingly may in practice mostly comprise undertakings established in that member state, of which the language constitutes an official language, appears inherent to the objective pursued. In other words, if you want to promote languages within the state, you have to restrict other language version films coming in. And it's incredibly unusual for the court to do something like this and actually respect the restriction of the market. It's only happened once, but it did happen in a case about languages. So, although there aren't particular substantive challenges, I don't think, for medium-sized language communities on this substantive side, what we have seen the beginnings of in this case is a signal. If you can make a good case, the EU might listen. Thank you.